Her name was Lila, and if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have told you she was the most grounded person I'd ever met. Lila wasn't flashy, wasn't the kind of woman who sought attention. She was content with quiet evenings at home, a glass of Merlot in one hand and a book in the other, the hum of our life together steady and predictable. But looking back now, I realize how easily I'd mistaken stillness for stability. It began on a Sunday. We were at her family's cabin, a place we hadn't visited in years. The air was crisp, the kind that made you want to breathe in deeply just to feel alive. Lila had always loved the place, said it reminded her of summers spent as a kid, skipping rocks across the lake with her brother. That day, she was unusually distracted. I'd called her name twice, but she didn't respond. She was staring at the water, her hands in her lap, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. When I asked if she was okay, she gave me a small smile and said she was fine, just tired. It wasn't an unusual answer, but something about the way she said it felt wrong. Forced. The first crack appeared that evening. As we packed up to leave, I found a notebook under the bed in the guest room. It wasn't hers, or at least, it wasn't one I'd ever seen her use. The cover was simple, unmarked, the kind you could pick up at any corner store. But inside, the pages told a different story. At first, I thought it was a journal. The handwriting was hers, but the entries didn't read like reflections. They were fragments, half-finished thoughts, lists of random details, like table for two, gray scarf, or 1240, the gilded fox. None of it made sense. Some pages were torn out, others blacked out entirely with thick marker strokes. I flipped through it, confused, until Lila appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask me what I was holding. She didn't have to. Her face tightened, her eyes flicking to the notebook in my hand before she walked into the room, calm and deliberate. "It's nothing important," she said, her voice light. "Just notes for a story I've been thinking about writing." She'd never mentioned wanting to write before. It wasn't like her to hide things, and for a moment, I considered pressing the issue. But her smile, too easy, too quick, stopped me. I handed her the notebook, and she slipped it into her bag without another word. 2 weeks later, another odd moment caught my attention. Lila had gone to the city for the day, saying she wanted to browse some antique shops and clear her head. When she returned, she was quieter than usual, her movements slower, more deliberate. She unpacked her shopping bag on the kitchen counter. A small vase, a pair of candlesticks, nothing unusual, and left the room. But later that evening, as I was cleaning up, I found a receipt tucked into one of the candlesticks. It listed more than what she'd brought home, 3 additional items, each marked gift wrap. My stomach twisted as I stared at the words. Who were the gifts for? Why hadn't she mentioned them? I didn't ask her. Not then. Instead, I placed the receipt back where I'd found it and tried to convince myself it was nothing, that there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. But the silence between us had begun to take shape, pressing down on me in a way I couldn't ignore. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like the faint hum of static in the background. And every day, it grew louder. A few weeks after the trip to the cabin, Lila came home with an old Polaroid camera. She explained it as a whim, something she'd picked up at a flea market. She wanted to document small moments, she said, to capture life's simplicity. It struck me as unusual. Lila wasn't sentimental about objects. If anything, she prided herself on not being tied down by material things. Still, I didn't question her. I chalked it up to another one of those quirks I'd been learning to accept as her sense of individuality. The first few days, the camera was everywhere. She photographed the sunlight hitting our living room rug, the frost creeping up the windows, even the dog sprawled across the kitchen floor. But after a while, the novelty seemed to wear off, and the camera disappeared into the drawer of her desk, out of sight and, I assumed, out of mind. Until the photograph appeared. I found it one Sunday morning, tucked beneath a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. It was a candid shot, the kind you'd expect to see in a scrapbook. A man sitting at a small cafe table, a coffee cup in his hand, his face turned away from the camera. His posture was relaxed, casual, like he didn't know he was being watched. It wasn't a remarkable photo, just an ordinary moment frozen in time. But it didn't take me long to realize the cafe wasn't anywhere nearby. The backdrop was too polished, The chair's too modern. It wasn't from our town, nor was it from any place we'd visited together. Lila came into the kitchen as I was staring at it. She froze when she saw it in my hand, her expression carefully neutral, as if bracing herself for the question she knew was coming. I asked her about it, trying to keep my voice even. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying that it was part of a project for her photography class. This was new information. She'd never mentioned taking a class, but she said it so smoothly, so convincingly, that I almost believed her. When I asked why she hadn't told me about the class, she shrugged, saying she'd signed up on impulse and it didn't seem worth mentioning. Then, without missing a beat, she reached for the photo and tucked it into her desk drawer, brushing the subject away with a smile. Her ease unsettled me. The conversation left no room for me to press further, yet the doubt lingered, thick and unshakable. Who was the man in the photo? And why hadn't she shared this new interest with me, the way she once would have? The weeks that followed were marked by a growing sense of distance. Lila spent more time at her desk, poring over what she claimed were photography books and class assignments. When I asked to see her work, she'd laugh and say it wasn't ready yet. One evening, while she was in the shower, I opened the desk drawer. The Polaroid camera sat there, its strap neatly coiled. I rifled through the papers beneath it, careful not to disturb anything, and found a stack of photographs. Most were innocent enough. Still lives of bookshelves, vases, and street corners. But halfway through the pile, my hand froze. There he was again. The same man, this time in sharper detail. His face was clearer, and his expression was one of familiarity, like he was laughing at something just out of frame. The pit in my stomach deepened as I flipped through more images of him. Walking along a park path, leaning against a lamppost, sitting in the passenger seat of what looked like Lila's car. Each photo carried a sense of intimacy, as though Lila wasn't just documenting moments but preserving something deeper, something secret. I put the photographs back exactly as I'd found them and closed the drawer, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a class project. It wasn't a hobby. That night, Lila came to bed later than usual, her hair damp from a shower. She slid under the covers beside me, her warmth a stark contrast to the icy knot of suspicion in my chest. As I lay there in the dark, the images of the man flickered through my mind, each one another unanswered question. The following week, I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. The man's face seemed to haunt me, appearing in my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. Who was he? How had he become a subject of Lila's attention, her lens focusing on him with an intimacy that felt deliberate? I began paying closer attention to her. Not the kind of attention I'd once given her. Thoughtful gestures, shared jokes, the small things that make up a marriage. No, this was different. It was surveillance. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, became something I dissected, searching for a crack in her story. One evening, as Lila worked at her desk, I lingered in the doorway, watching her. She was bent over her notebook, her pen moving in quick, fluid strokes. A faint smile played on her lips, the kind that once had been reserved for moments we shared together. I asked her casually about her photography project, mentioning that it seemed to be taking up a lot of her time. Her answer was light and deflective. She was trying to get it just right before showing me anything. She laughed, calling herself a perfectionist, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. The next day, I decided to follow her. She had told me she was heading to a gallery downtown to meet her photography instructor and finalize her portfolio. It seemed reasonable enough, but something about the way she avoided meeting my eyes as she left made me uneasy. I waited until she was halfway down the street before getting into my car and following at a distance. She didn't go downtown. Instead, her car weaved through side streets, heading toward the outskirts of the city. She pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, one I didn't recognize, and parked near the back. From where I sat in my car, I watched her get out and glance around, her movements deliberate but cautious. She adjusted her coat, smoothed her hair, and then walked inside. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding in my chest. For several minutes, I debated whether to follow her in, to confront her then and there. But something held me back. Instead, I waited. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, she emerged, and she wasn't alone. The man from the photographs walked beside her, his hand brushing hers as they strolled to her car. She laughed at something he said, her head tilting back in a way that made my stomach twist. I couldn't hear them, couldn't see much beyond the casual ease of their interaction, but it was enough to confirm what I'd been dreading. This wasn't a class project. This wasn't innocent. I gripped the steering wheel, torn between anger and despair as I watched her unlock the car. The man leaned against it, his body close to hers as they exchanged a few more words. Then, to my horror, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. A gesture so tender, so personal, it felt like a physical blow. I drove away before I could see any more. That night, Lila came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and sat down to dinner with the same practiced ease she'd had for years. But I could see it now, the careful construction of her lies, the way she filled the silence between us with meaningless chatter, all to mask the truth. As I lay in bed that night, I realized the weight of my discovery wasn't just in her betrayal, but in the way it had made me a stranger to my own life. The routines, the comforts, the sense of stability I'd taken for granted. All of it felt hollow now, a facade hiding the cracks that had been growing for months, maybe years. The next morning, as Lila slept soundly beside me, I made a decision. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. I woke before dawn, the house draped in its usual quiet, but there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. Lila slept soundly beside me, her features serene in the pale light of morning. Watching her like this, it was hard to reconcile the woman I loved with the one I now suspected of leading a double life. I slipped out of bed carefully, unwilling to wake her, and found myself standing in the small room we called an office. The Polaroid camera was still there, a silent reminder of the questions it had raised. But today, my attention wasn't on her photos or even her laptop. It was on a name, Gavin. The day before, when Lila had mentioned another gallery opening, I'd paid close attention. She spoke casually, as if the evening was just another professional obligation, but her body betrayed her. A subtle hesitation in her words, a faint flush in her cheeks. It wasn't nervousness, it was anticipation. I needed more than speculation, so I made a call. To Liam, an old friend who worked as an art dealer in the city. Liam had always been a little unconventional, his reputation built more on charm than professionalism. He knew everyone in the art world, from struggling painters to high-end consultants. If anyone could tell me who Gavin was, it was him. When Liam picked up, I asked him outright about the name. His voice immediately shifted from its usual jovial tone to one of curiosity. Gavin Marshall, he told me, was a rising star in the art consultancy business, a man known for connecting elite buyers with up-and-coming artists. Gavin had a reputation for being magnetic, someone who charmed his way into exclusive circles with ease. But it wasn't just his charm that set him apart. According to Liam, Gavin had a habit of forming personal relationships with the artists he worked with, relationships that often went beyond the professional. He was dangerous, Liam said, not because of malice but because of his ability to make people feel like they were the center of the universe. The words hit me like a punch. The man I'd seen in the photographs, the man who'd been occupying Lila's time and attention, wasn't just anyone. He was someone skilled at weaving himself into the lives of others, someone who thrived on intimacy. Liam promised to dig deeper, offering to check into Gavin's recent dealings and whether Lila had crossed paths with him professionally. In the meantime, I decided to track her movements myself. That evening, Lila left for the gallery opening, dressed impeccably in a way that made my chest ache. She kissed me goodbye with the same warmth she always had, the scent of her perfume lingering long after the door had closed behind her. I followed her at a distance, my car blending into the stream of traffic as she made her way into the city. She parked near a small gallery I didn't recognize, its front lit softly by warm yellow lights. I waited in my car, my pulse racing, as she stepped inside. Hours passed. I told myself to leave, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but my gut wouldn't let me. When she finally emerged, it wasn't alone. Gavin was with her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they walked to a nearby restaurant. They sat by the window, their conversation animated and intimate. Lila leaned forward, her expression open in a way I hadn't seen in months. My chest tightened as I watched her laugh at something he said, the sound too faint to hear but clear in the way her shoulders shook. This wasn't a casual meeting. It wasn't work. I drove home before they left. The sight of them together burned into my mind. By the time Lila returned, it was well past midnight. I pretended to be asleep, listening as she moved quietly through the house, her footsteps light and deliberate. The next day, I received a text from Liam. He'd found out more about Gavin, including his involvement in curating an upcoming exhibition featuring new talent, an exhibition Lila had been working toward for months. The dots began to connect. Gavin wasn't just an intruder in my marriage. He was someone who held sway over Lila's dreams, someone who could offer her opportunities one never could. But it didn't end there. Liam mentioned that Gavin had a history of leaving wreckage in his wake. Broken partnerships, artists who felt discarded once they were no longer useful. He was dangerous in a way I hadn't fully understood, not just to my marriage but to Lila herself. That evening, I watched her across the dinner table, the candlelight catching the angles of her face. I wanted to ask her, to demand the truth, but something held me back. The woman I'd known for so long was still there, wasn't she? Or had she already slipped away, one choice at a time? The questions hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. And as I sat there, staring at the person I thought I knew, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear her answers, or if I was strong enough to face them. The days following my discovery were a blur of quiet turmoil. Lila's presence in the house became almost unbearable, her every move laced with the weight of my suspicion. She seemed more at ease than I'd expected, moving through our routines with a calm I envied. But now I saw it for what it was. An act so finely tuned it might have fooled me forever if I hadn't followed her that night. I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I wasn't ready for the fight, for the lies she'd surely try to spin. Instead, I chose a different path. If Gavin was the thread unraveling our life, I wanted to pull on it until I had the whole picture. Liam sent me another message the next morning, short but direct. He's in deep with someone big. There's money involved. Can't say for sure if it's connected to Lila, but it's worth looking into. Money. That word alone sent my mind reeling. Lila had always been independent, her art studio modest but self-sustaining. She never asked for financial help, not even when business slowed down. But now I wondered if she'd needed more than she let on. If Gavin had offered her something she couldn't refuse. To confirm my suspicions, I did something I never thought I would. While Lila was in the shower, I slipped into her studio. The space, once a source of pride for her, now felt alien to me. Canvases leaned against the walls, their abstract patterns vivid and striking. Her desk was cluttered with brushes, paints, and papers, as chaotic as her mind seemed to be lately. I rifled through her files, my hands trembling as I searched for something, anything, that could explain her connection to Gavin. And then I found it. A series of invoices tucked into a folder at the bottom of a drawer. They weren't from clients or suppliers. They were from Gavin himself, issued through a consulting firm bearing his name. The invoices detailed exorbitant advisory fees for services I couldn't decipher. One mentioned creative representation, another market placement strategy. But the numbers were clear, and they were staggering. Thousands of dollars. More than Lila could have afforded without dipping into our savings. My chest tightened as I stared at the dates. They lined up perfectly with her late nights, her unexplained absences. Gavin hadn't just been guiding her career. He'd been profiting from it, draining money she hadn't told me she was spending. I heard the water stop and quickly replaced the folder, retreating to the living room before she emerged. Lila walked in moments later, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed from the steam. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that used to make me feel grounded. Now it felt like a mask. That evening, I kept my distance. I needed time to process what I'd found, to understand how far this betrayal had gone. If Gavin was using her for money, was that the extent of it? Or was there more? Something darker? Beneath the surface? The next day, I decided to act. Using the information from the invoices, I reached out to a business contact I'd worked with on a past project, a financial analyst named Paige. She was sharp and discreet, someone I trusted to help me make sense of the mess I'd uncovered. Paige's findings came quickly. Gavin's firm wasn't just consulting for artists. It was a front for high-stakes transactions in the art world. His services included arranging under-the-table sales, inflating the value of certain works, and securing investments from wealthy patrons. Lila's involvement was murky, but the invoices pointed to her studio as one of Gavin's clients. Paige's final comment stuck with me. She said that Gavin's operations were as much about influence as they were about money. His clients weren't just artists. They were people he could manipulate, using their talent and vulnerability to serve his own interests. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. Gavin hadn't just seduced Lila emotionally. He'd drawn her into something far more insidious. Her art, her reputation, even her financial stability. He controlled it all. That night, as Lila sat on the couch flipping through a book, I couldn't hold back any longer. I told her I'd been to her studio, that I'd seen the invoices. The words came out colder than I intended, but I couldn't stop them. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't deny it. Instead, she froze, her face pale and her hands gripping the book so tightly her knuckles turned white. I pressed her, asking how long she'd been working with Gavin, why she hadn't told me about the money. She stammered, searching for the right words, but I could see the truth in her eyes. It wasn't just about money, and it wasn't just about art. Gavin had become a part of her life in a way I couldn't compete with, a way that made her betray not just our marriage but herself. She finally admitted it. She'd been in over her head from the start. Gavin had promised her everything: connections, success, the recognition she craved for years. But the cost had been higher than she realized, and now she didn't know how to untangle herself from him. As she spoke, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions: anger at her choices, sadness for what we'd lost, and a flicker of something I hadn't expected: pity. Lila wasn't just complicit in Gavin's schemes. She was trapped in them. By the time she finished, tears streaming down her face, I realized the road ahead wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about deciding whether I wanted to save her or walk away for good. Lila sat across from me at the kitchen table, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, gripping them tightly, as if trying to hold herself together. Her confession hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, its weight pressing down on my chest. She had given me the outline of her betrayal, but it was the details, the ones she couldn't bring herself to say, that screamed the loudest. She spoke about Gavin's charm, his promises of opportunity and success, his way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She didn't have to say it outright, but I knew. She had fallen for him, willingly let herself be pulled into his orbit, and now, here we were, staring at the wreckage. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers to questions I wasn't sure I could handle. Instead, I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. Inside, my emotions churned: rage at her, disgust at Gavin, and a hollow ache that whispered of everything we'd lost. How could you? The words finally slipped from my lips, low and broken. Lila flinched, tears spilling over as she shook her head. She told me she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. Gavin had come into her life when she felt invisible, buried under the monotony of our routines, her studio struggling to stay afloat. At first, he had been a mentor, someone who understood her art, who believed in her potential. She insisted that she hadn't gone looking for him, hadn't set out to betray me. But her words felt like excuses, weak justifications for choices that had shattered everything we had built. I could barely look at her, my chest tight with the weight of it all. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the sacrifices, the small joys, the moments that had once made us unshakable. I thought about how I had loved her completely, how I had trusted her without question. And now, all of it felt like a lie. I asked her if she loved him, and the hesitation in her answer cut deeper than any words could. She insisted that it wasn't love, that Gavin had been a mistake, but her voice cracked as she said it, and I could see the truth in her eyes. Maybe she didn't love him, but she had wanted him. She had chosen him in ways that left no room for me. Her tears came harder now, her words spilling out in a jumbled mess as she tried to explain herself. She begged me to understand, to see that she was lost and desperate, that she had felt like she was drowning and Gavin had been the lifeline she'd reached for. But all I could hear was the silence that had grown between us over the years, the silence I had ignored, convinced it was just the natural ebb and flow of marriage. And now that silence was roaring, filling every corner of my mind with the undeniable truth. I didn't know this version of her. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her sobs caught in her throat as she looked up at me, her expression pleading. I couldn't be in the same room as her anymore. The walls of the house felt too close, the air too thick with her betrayal. I walked out, ignoring her voice calling after me, and got into the car. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing in 100 directions at once. The image of Gavin's hand brushing against hers, the memory of her smile when she left for the gallery, the sound of her saying she hadn't meant for this to happen. It all swirled together, a storm I couldn't escape. I drove aimlessly, the streets blurring past me as I tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. Anger bubbled to the surface, but it was tempered by a deep, hollow sadness that settled in my chest like a stone. This wasn't just about Lila's betrayal. It was about the cracks in our marriage I had refused to see. I thought about the person she used to be, the woman who had once written me love notes on the backs of napkins, who had laughed with me late into the night over nothing at all, who had held my hand so tightly during the hardest moments of our lives. I thought about the promises we had made, the life we had built together, and how easily it had all come undone. And then I thought about the man I had become, the man who had let work consume him, who had stopped asking her about her dreams, who had assumed that love alone would be enough to keep us afloat. By the time I pulled into an empty parking lot, the sky was dark, and the car's engine hummed softly in the silence. My head fell against the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing, tried to stop the wave of emotions threatening to pull me under. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I could forgive her, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, and the pieces left behind didn't feel like enough to rebuild. Sitting there in the dark, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could confront Gavin, tear him down for the role he had played in all of this, or I could walk away from both of them and start over. But neither choice felt right, not yet. For now, all I could do was sit with the weight of it, the ache of everything I'd lost, and wonder if there was anything left worth saving. I returned home well past midnight, the house bathed in darkness except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Lila was there, sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. She didn't look up when I entered, but her shoulders tensed, as though she'd been bracing herself for my return. The air between us was heavy, thick with words that hadn't yet been spoken. For a moment, I stood there, the door still ajar behind me, the night air cold against my back. I wanted to step back into the silence of the outside world, to avoid what I knew was coming. But it was time. I closed the door and walked into the kitchen, my footsteps deliberate. She finally lifted her head, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her eyes searched mine, looking for something, hope, maybe forgiveness, but all she found was the quiet fury I could no longer contain. Her voice broke the silence first, trembling and raw. She apologized again, her words spilling out in desperate, half-formed sentences. She begged me to listen, to understand, to believe that she still loved me. But the sound of her voice only made the knot in my chest tighten. I told her to stop. My voice was sharp, louder than I intended, and it echoed through the room like a slap. She flinched but didn't back down, her own voice rising as she tried to defend herself. She said she had been lost, that Gavin had been a mistake, that she had only wanted to feel alive again. Her words sent a jolt of rage through me, and before I could stop myself, I slammed my fist against the table. The sound was deafening, cutting through her pleas and leaving the room in stunned silence. I demanded to know how she could do this, how she could stand there and justify tearing apart everything we had built. I asked her if she had even thought about what this would do to me, to us, to the life we'd spent over a decade creating. My voice rose with every word until I was shouting, the anger and heartbreak spilling out in waves. Lila didn't shout back. Not at first. She stared at me, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance, before her own emotions boiled over. She told me I hadn't been there for her, that I had been blind to her pain, that I had let her drift so far away that she didn't know how to come back. Her words hit me like a blow, not because they were lies, but because I could feel the kernel of truth in them. But that truth didn't absolve her. It didn't erase the betrayal, the lies, the choices she had made. I told her it didn't matter how lost she had felt, that there had been 1,000 ways to tell me, to ask for help, to fix what was broken. But instead, she had chosen him. She had chosen secrecy, deceit, and destruction. Her voice cracked as she screamed that she hadn't chosen him over me, that she had been weak, scared, unsure of herself. But her excuses only fueled my anger, and I shouted back, asking if she had thought about me at all while she was with him, while she let him touch her, while she betrayed the vows we had made. The room felt like it was closing in, the weight of our voices crashing against the walls, filling every corner with the pain we had tried to suppress. Finally, when the shouting gave way to silence, I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized there was nothing left to say. The woman standing in front of me was someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust. I told her I was done. I told her I couldn't live with this, couldn't pretend to fix something that was beyond repair. My voice was steady now, calm in a way that felt strange after the storm. Her sobs filled the room as she begged me not to leave, to give her a chance to make it right. But I couldn't. The part of me that had once fought for her, that had believed in her, was gone. I left the room, her cries following me as I walked upstairs. I packed a bag in silence, the motions mechanical, my mind already shutting down to the reality of what was happening. When I walked past her again, she grabbed my arm, her grip desperate. She said we could rebuild, that she would do anything to make it better. But I pulled away, telling her I didn't want to rebuild something so broken. The door slammed behind me as I walked out into the night, the cold air biting against my skin. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was leaving. For the first time in years, I felt something close to clarity. It wasn't peace. It would be a long time before I found that, but it was certainty. The life we had built was over, and whatever came next would be mine alone to create. Her screams echoed in my mind as I drove away, but they didn't hold me back. They were the sound of something ending, and as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. Sometimes, breaking away is the only way to survive.